Today's topic is Women on the Autism Spectrum, a Hidden Population with Dania Jekel. Diana and Dania, I will turn it over to you.
Thank you, Brandy. Welcome, everybody. I'm really excited to talk to Dania about women on the autism spectrum. I wondered when I was really getting ready for this subject if, like other mental health treatments that were designed and originated around male disorders, whether some of our understanding of women on the autism spectrum may or may not be appropriate just because it was learned through male diagnosis. So I'm going to start asking Dania questions because I'm really curious about this subject. Can you start at the beginning and say, what does a woman on the autism spectrum look like in that realm?
Sure. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me, and it's a pleasure to be here. So, you started with a really tough question, because as you probably know, there's an expression in the autism community: if you've seen one person, and it actually started with Asperger's, if you've seen one person with Asperger's, you've seen one person with Asperger's. And that is, I think, also true for women. The variety of women on the spectrum is just huge. And it's not really a spectrum, so to speak, where they're sort of higher to low or anything like that. It's more like a universe of people with different compilations of sort of traits and other things that are both challenges and strengths. So you have like a universe of people. So it's extraordinarily hard to answer that question, with a few words. I think that what you said at the beginning is also true, that the diagnosis was sort of conceived with men and boys. And so that it has been a very, very long time for, the sort of understanding of women on the spectrum to come to the fore.
Thank you. I just had that imagination that it must have, because most of the literature seemed to be about going back. The research and the literature seemed to talk about males on the spectrum.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting because when we first started A&E 25 years ago, we had probably for every male who came in, for every female who came into the organization to get support, there were 4 males. So a sort of a 1 to 4. And sometimes it was even a 1 to 6. But as we sort of are progressing and the understanding is growing in terms of this very hidden population, we now have 50-50 coming into our organization for support. So for every male who comes in, there is a female. We also have a population of people who are non-binary, but that's not what we're talking about today. But we're really looking at 50-50, and I would not be surprised if sort of as the awareness and understanding of females on the spectrum grows, that we're going to see much more of an even 50-50 population.
Very interesting, because that is true in other diagnoses in converse. We're starting to see that in eating disorders for men and women. Those are starting to again balance out. So maybe we aren't as different as we think we are in sort of our struggles with mental health and with differences in thought. Maybe we aren't.
I agree. Yes.
Go ahead. So you work with adult women, correct? Is that your forte? Is that your general population that you are more interested in, the adult population of women? Is that
well, if you talk about me personally, yes, I am interested in adults on the autism spectrum. I am particularly interested in women. Our organization, though, serves children, families, parents, all, both genders or all genders, and also, all ages. But my particular expertise has always been adults, and particularly women.
So I would love to hear more about your work, because I probably have a real ignorant gap. And I'm sure people watching this also have a gap. We hear a lot about services for kids young kids, elementary school kids on the autism spectrum. We hear services, sometimes in high school, we might hear somebody's having trouble with transitions and having difficulty in getting to the next step. We don't hear much about adults in general on the autism spectrum. What are we dealing with here? What are we?
And that's a really true statement. You know, kids are cute. They have school. They're fun to work with. So you see a lot of the research and other things are around children. And you are completely right. After the teen years, they kind of drop off the map. And not only, and the interesting thing is people are adults much, much longer than they are children. I mean, they're adults for years and years and years. And for a child, you're, child for 18 years. So there are many, many more adults who are on the spectrum than children. And you do see one of the hardest parts for people on the spectrum, and this is males and females, is really the age 20 to 30. Because what happens, both men and women, their peers, they sort of get careers, they get married, they start to have children, they, are employed, whatever. And this is a particularly hard time for our folks because they are not doing what is sort of normally expected between age 20 and 30. Very often they still live with their parents and, they're just not as independent because, again, for males and females, developmentally, they're very often significantly behind in sort of the social and emotional development, not in the intellectual development, though. Sometimes they're way, way ahead. So it's sort of a real split between being, fairly smart and, having this tremendous memories, having all kinds of talents, but socially or emotionally really still being like children, even though they're adults.
So one of my son was evaluated when he was young, and the psychologist who evaluated him said, there's good news, there's bad news, but really he's going about 100 miles an hour on 3 wheels.
Yeah.
That was how she described it,
Yeah. Some of our parks go 100 miles an hour and some of them go, probably 20 miles an hour. It's sort of a process. Again, everybody's really different. But what we see for women is that they're actually, and I sort of missed your question, but I'll proceed anyway.
Keep going. This is where I want to go. So
yeah.
Go.
What we see with women is they are not acting out as children. They're sort of taking, the bullying and some of the other stuff, that sort of feeling that they're alien or strangers or different from other people. And they're taking that and that they're sort of, it's becoming part of who they are. And their self-esteem really suffers. And instead of acting out, very often, there's more anxiety and depression that you see for the girls. So they don't get identified, or if they do get identified, they get identified with sort of an anxiety disorder or or depression. And the sort of core that they are neurologically thinking differently, that core is missed. And so then they start getting treated for mental health issues. And that is really, and as they grow up, they don't understand why it's not helping. Why is the treatment or why is the therapy not working? Why can't I change? Why can't I be, somebody else? They just don't understand that actually they are, who they are is these differences are neurological. They're not going to change. And they, instead of sort of growing up and embracing who they are, they grow up feeling terrible about who they are. Yeah, they're I can't do this. It's so negative. I can't do that. I can't do this. Why don't people like me? So they have all these questions, so that it's really harmful for the girls that they are identified so late. And we're having women come into AA&E very, very late in the, in their lives, not very late, but 40, 50, 60, 70 plus, where they're identified, they are older folks, and they're identifying themselves. And all my life, I have felt different. I have struggled. I've had this anxiety, things didn't work out for me. And then, they see a video, they read a book, or, they Google, and they say, this just fits me like a glove. This, it was like somebody was a fly on my wall. This was my life. And then they say, I think this is maybe, an explanation, and they get a different sort of lens or perspective in which to view their lives. And that can be very, very helpful, no matter what age you do it. And it's so helpful not to think that there's something wrong with me, but rather think, there's something different about me. I'm thinking differently, and just being able to come out of that sort of place where you don't like who you are is so important.
Absolutely.
And if I can add, sorry, if I can add
No,
one more
you
thing.
keep going.
And at A&E, that's sort of what we do. We get people together in communities and support groups so they can meet each other very often and talk and feel they're not alone. This is something that there's commonality with other people. And then when they're with other people, they don't have to pretend to be who they aren't. So one of the things we see about women is that they tend to have to sort of learn the skills, and they observe other people, and they say, oh, I have to be like this, I have to dress like this, I have to, perform like this, whatever. And what that does, it puts a lot of stress on them, and it makes them very, very tired. It's exhausting to try to pretend to be like other people. And that exhaustion takes a toll, a really bad toll on people's mental health, and just on their life. And so that they, they end up being exhausted all the time, anxious all the time, anxious they're going to do the wrong thing, say the wrong thing. So sort of pretending, as Leanne Willie, who's an author on the spectrum, said, pretending to be normal. That is something that a lot of women do, and they do it successfully, but it takes a toll.
Absolutely. They must not ever really feel seen if they don't understand, they don't have the information. Everybody's just treating them like who they appear to be and not who they are. Yeah.
That's right.
That would be exhausting. It would. What kinds of disorders do you tend to see among, women with autism spectrum?
What kind of disorders? Okay, so yeah, the thing we see for all people on the spectrum, whether you're male or female, is anxiety. And anxiety, I think there are two reasons. First of all, anxiety, for some people, there seem to be just a biological heightened anxiety naturally. But in addition, there's the anxiety that if you're going to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing, because you're processing information in such a different way that you make mistakes while you're in the world. And so that also sort of heightens that anxiety. So anxiety is the biggest thing that we see in women and in everybody on the spectrum, and especially women. We also see depression as sort of, they tend to sort of feel badly about themselves, and they, it's sort of this chronic underlying depression sometimes. But there are things that seem to, coexist with people, women with autism, eating disabilities. Again, that's with men too. But sometimes there's sort of restricted eating or overeating, and so eating issues. There's sleep issues. Again, everybody, many, I'm not saying everybody, but many people on the spectrum have sleeping issues. And I know this is not mental health things, but relationship issues. A lot of people just have relationship issues. And so there's some OCD, there are coexisting OCD and sometimes bipolar that comes with it. We see some of the women we think are many, I would say probably many women, when they get to be adults and maybe don't have autism, a diagnosis, they actually get diagnosed with a mental health issue, bipolar or some personality disorder, all kinds of things. So they get mental health diagnoses rather than the autism diagnoses, and that's not healthy because the treatments are so different. And if you don't understand that,
yeah, can we tease out what would, if we were to go to the fork in the road, one is autism spectrum, one is mental health, what do the treatments, how do they vary?
okay, so first of all, yeah, I mean, there is no, let me just first say, there's no medication for
Right.
autism per se.
Okay.
So that you can get medicated for things that are sort of for the anxiety, for the sort of co-occurring conditions, the depression, the anxiety, the OCD, you can get medication for those. But if you're doing, for example, what we recommend for somebody in the spectrum to sort of feel better is to get to know themselves, to use the autism lens to understand themselves, to create an environment. And this is probably the most important thing, to create an environment that is good for them. Whether it's simplifying life, whether it's, living in a place where there's not a lot of noise, whether there's working from home, just, getting the stress, stress down, having, running, having passions that you like, that relax you, whether it's knitting or, running or whatever, so that, those are not necessarily things that you would see if somebody, let's say, has bipolar. For bipolar, you would want, to have medication and,
Blood work checks, lithium doses to make sure the blood
right,
works.
exactly. It's more of a psychiatric kind of thing. So that, if you're in the spectrum, I mean, you may also have sort of bipolar, and then
They're not mutually exclusive. Yes.
They're not, exactly. They're not mutually exclusive, but if you don't understand the autism piece of it, you're going to just miss, opportunities for the person to feel better.
Something huge. We have started really being good about recommending assessment programs that do some neuropsych work, and for that reason, so that we have not just a mental health diagnosis, but are there learning differences? Are there approaches? Are they neurologically atypical? So, because I think it's important to have both of those evaluations.
Right. I absolutely agree with you. I think an evaluation is key. I think if you don't look at somebody's past, so, if I was talking to somebody, I would be asking about, did they have friends in childhood? What was school like? Were they able to write? Were they bullied? So because for autism, even in a woman, if you know what you're looking for, you can sort of see it very, very early on. And so you're really looking at very, very good developmental histories and, what kind of things, and the issue is that people are very often so bright, and I'm talking more like an Asperger profile. They're so bright and they have such good memories that they can really cover this up really well. And they're not, there's sort of this myth that people with autism are little geeks and they all like to systematize and whatever. But many of our women, I mean, they're creative, they're artists, they're not, they're not in the STEM field. They're writers, poets. They're just unbelievably musicians. They're unbelievably creative, and they don't fit the stereotype. So that's why very often they're missed. But if you just sort of, if you if you're doing an evaluation and you know what to look for, you know, you will be able to see it.
What would be a few things you would look for in beginning that?
What would I look for? I would look for, I think social and communication issues are probably sort of the biggest, meaning, you know, difficulty with friends, liking routine is a big one, really disliking change. Let's see, you know, sort of having some trouble in school. I mean, when you're looking at children, you know, sort of your learning style can be very, very different. And you may not sort of be able to learn in the same way that other children learn. Very often women have incredible sensory issues. So they can be very, they can take in other people's emotions. So if you're talking to somebody and you're feeling sort of upset, they can then feel upset. Or they, you know, loud noises bother them, water bothers them, or they really like water. I mean, so there's sort of both ends there. But the sensory stuff is something, you know, that is a real indicator. Sort of, you know, having sort of slower processing speed. That's also an indicator that, you know, people may be on the spectrum. So those are some of the indicators for women.
I guess what I would wonder when you said slow processing speed, I wonder if it would look like slow processing speed because they have to go through a filter of translating their experience into what the world wants to hear.
Yes, that's exactly right. Most of us sort of intuitively, let's say we go into a room filled with people, we intuitively know, well, who looks receptive to, you know, we could go over and talk to that person, or we could, you know, we're not really thinking it out necessarily. We're intuitively just doing what needs to be done and acting in a you know, pretty much socially appropriate way. Somebody on the spectrum, and let's say a woman on the spectrum who goes into a situation like that, she has to think about it. Okay, that person, you know, looks like they're standing alone. So maybe they, you know, or they're holding a dog. So maybe I can go up and talk about a dog, or, you know, so they are sort of thinking this out in their head. It's a cognitive process rather than just an intuitive process. And that takes a little time, and that is, you know, it's tiring and it's more difficult. It's also is the same that sometimes people on the spectrum, they sort of don't know what to say. So they have to sort of figure that out, you know, what is the right way. They have files in their head, or they, you know, but also it's a cognitive process to figure out what to say. Now, there are people on the spectrum who sort of lack a little bit of a filter. So they tend to sort of say what's in their head, you know, what they're thinking comes out of their mouth. And but as you grow older, you understand that you better have that filter there, or you're going to get into trouble. And that also sort of adds a
my
layer.
mother that, Dania. She
What?
has nobody taught my mother that. We call her blurt, whereas we tell her she's missing the governor between thought and speech, and
Yeah.
it's blurt. So we
Yeah.
see that. We see,
And it, unfortunately, you know, you can unintentionally hurt people, disrupt friendships, you know,
Yeah.
if you are not, if you really don't understand what to say or how to say it, or how somebody might feel if you say this, you know, if you're not sort of really cognizant of that, those things, and that's how people lose friends, unfortunately. So and that's not just a female thing, that's really, you know, goes across all genders. Yeah.
Brandy, I see your appearance. Do we have questions?
Yes, we do have questions from the audience, and I would like to open it up to the rest of the audience as well if anyone has questions. But the first question we have says, I appreciate this developmental frame and wondering how many women you see who were originally diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, but actually are on the autism spectrum.
Yes, a lot. That is one of the
Okay.
diagnoses that women, and a little bit less so now. I would say this is, in the last maybe 5 years, there's been a little bit more understanding about this, but many of the women who come to us have a personality disorder. Yes. That's borderline personality, sometimes narcissistic personality, but very often bipolar. They're sort of that's another sort of big misdiagnosis.
I can see that. I mean,
And that's because people's moods are really variable depending on the environment and the situation. And they can take in very often they're very disturbed by what's happening in the world. We have a lot of people who really are environmentalists and activists in many areas. And they're very, very hypersensitive to what's going on. And so it looks almost bipolar. But yes, that was a good question. We do get that diagnosis.
We have another question. I'm going to allow Kate to talk now.
Hi, Kate Callahan. Thank you so much for this platform. Amazing. I did a lot of work when I was younger with individuals with developmental disabilities and autism and on the Asperger spectrum. And it was definitely the people that I worked with, it was definitely misdiagnosed a lot, not understanding whether it be lack of communication skills or not understanding those boundaries that you talked about, and instead was diagnosed. It's always like a negative type of behavior type thing. It's a behavioral issue. I'm just wondering, I know you already touched on some of the, areas where to look for in an assessment. So I have somebody now that I'm working with that shows different signs of, like, she's very, very smart in some areas, almost a little, I guess we could say, well, she knows every show tune possible and wants to sing it. I'm like, okay, not right now. We don't need to sing. But I'm just wondering, her family always thought she was kind of odd and doesn't understand. And, the education I've done with them is, it doesn't mean she's bad. She's not trying to be disorganized. She's not trying to do these things. She just sees things differently. But anyway, so I'm familiar with A&E, and I was just wondering, with somebody that does not have a lot of finances, how I could possibly get that assessment, because I really think that would be pivotal for her current situation, long-term, and kind of, what you were talking a little bit about reframing and kind of, yeah, so those are a lot of questions, but.
Absolutely. And just to reiterate, essentially what you said, the reframing, the different perspective, understanding oneself is really good. And then for people around you to also understand you, because it's so easy to say, oh, this person's lazy, or they're not trying hard enough, or they're stupid. So it's so easy to label people with other things if you don't understand sort of the neurology. But your question is, where can somebody get a diagnosis? And this is an issue. This has been an issue because there are not enough people who can do who understand women on the spectrum enough to do a really good diagnosis. So I would say there are if this woman has insurance, you can go to hospitals and clinics. There are some good ones around. If you go to a private neuropsychologist or psychologist, you are going to pay privately. Place like Nesco or whatever, you can get a diagnosis, but it is expensive. But if you go to a place like Brigham, Beth Israel or Brigham, they have clinics, or Mass General, they have clinics. they have autism clinics. So I would look at some of the clinics in the area. And if you want more specific information, that is what A&E does. So the person can call A&E and say, you know, I'm looking for a diagnosis. You know, I either don't have insurance, or I have this insurance, or, you know, I have Medicare or whatever. And somebody can help you identify where you might go for a diagnosis. But it is an issue across the country getting somebody who understands women to have a diagnosis. And you don't want somebody to get another diagnosis of, you know, bipolar. You know, you want a good, you want somebody who really understands.
Yeah, that's great advice. Thank you. When you say ANE for our audience, what do those initials stand for?
Yeah, it's AANE. It's the Asperger Autism Network.
Okay.
And we're located in Watertown. We have a web presence that you can find us on, you know, and, you know, families can you know, email us, call us. There's a contact us form on the website. And we are there, you know, to help. We have many, many groups. They're just starting up now for women on the spectrum. They fill up extremely fast. They're virtual right now. We have, you know, other activities just for women, because we know very often, you know, women have particular issues that maybe the men don't have, or so that we do, the women can join some of the men's activities, you know, game night, whatever. But we also have special programs just for the women, because it's just so essential.
Great. Appreciate that.
It is 11:30, but we do have one more question if you all are willing to take it.
Okay, I'm game. You ready
Okay.
for one more?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
Can you recommend some key social emotional strategies or tips for empowering women in these areas of challenges?
Sure. So I think I mentioned before, well, the first thing is really to understand yourself and stop blaming yourself. So that might be, you know, you may need a therapist to do this. You may need to get some CBT, but to sort of get the autism perspective and to understand yourself and start liking yourself. I mean, that's just absolutely key. You know, people have been teased and bullied and, you know, just not managed in life. And then their self-esteem really, you know, is pretty much in the toilet, so to speak. And so that's sort of the first thing. Get yourself an environment that works for you. You know, don't, just because you're supposed to be doing certain things doesn't mean you have to. You need to find a life that suits you, who you are. So, and that could mean any number of things, you know, for different people. And then, you know, if you want to work with some kind of a coach who can sort of, you know, help you figure out, sometimes you sort of need another person who will sort of help you figure out what to, you know, how to proceed in the world, so that, you know, you sort of find the life that you want to live. And I think talking to other people, other, you know, women on the spectrum or other people on the spectrum is extraordinarily helpful to understand that you are not alone in dealing with this.
That's great. Thank you, Dania. Appreciate it. We're going to close out for today. We appreciate all of you joining us and look forward to next week's Collegial Conversation. Have a great afternoon.
Okay.